Okay, thanks for waiting, everyone. Welcome to this introductory webinar with Squared Up. My name's Ashley. I'm going to be walking you through monitoring SQL today. The topics that we'll be covering are relatively high level. The information that we're going to look at comes from the SQL management pack, so have something hopefully most of you already have installed and are using. We're going to talk about how health rolls up, which includes the relationships between objects. We're going to talk very briefly about permissions. In general, quite a complex topic, but I will be sort of giving you a little bit of advice around that. We're also going to take a look at some application dashboards, so SQL in the context of what we define as an enterprise application in Squared Up. And then finally, we're going to look at some extended SQL monitoring, some management packs that may be of use to you guys that you haven't used before, and then we'll open up the floor to some questions. So, the SQL Management Pack is provided by Microsoft. It's available for SCOM 2012 R2 and above. It supports SQL 2012 up to 2017, and that includes SQL on Linux, which is actually an agentless monitoring option. The management pack itself discovers multiple objects, so SQL as an application isn't just a database, there are many objects related to that. Initially a database engine or a SQL instance, as you may have heard it referred to before. It supports multiple editions, including the Evaluation Edition and Express, which I believe are both free. The databases, not just the databases themselves, but the file groups, the data files, and the transaction log files. So if you've ever been asked, does SCOM monitor the transaction log on a SQL database, the short answer is yes. It also includes monitoring for always-on availability groups, whether that's distributed availability groups or the sort of standard ones, and then also memory-optimized tables as well. As well as discovering these objects, it also discovers properties for those objects. This can include very basic information, such as the collation, right up to the location of, say, a log file or a database file on disk on the machine. And there is also optional performance collection for a huge number of metrics, not all of which are enabled by default. It is ultimately down to you and your SQL team to define what is important to them. Enabling all of those metrics for every single object is not an effective way of monitoring something, but I'm sure that's a conversation that you have had around SCOM and monitoring in general before. So now, let's just quickly talk about how health rolls up. One thing that you should always do before you import a management pack into SCOM is to check out the management pack guide. Not only does it detail how to import the management pack if there's any additional configuration, but it also shows how the health rolls up for the objects contained within that management pack. And this is quite important when it comes to Squared Up. Health in general rolls up through the child-parent relationship in SCOM. In particular, the way that we actually navigate through that tree is through what we call drill downs. And as you can see, if you wanted to find the database files for a particular object, you'd start at the database engine. You can then drill down into the database, then into the file groups, and then to the files themselves. And that drill down allows you to traverse that parent-child relationship with relative ease, and there's various information that you can gain at those different levels. Permissions are an interesting topic for most when it comes to SQL. In general, allowing access for the SCOM agent in the default configuration essentially allows it to have SA permissions, which is far too high. It's not necessarily for full monitoring. It is possible to configure it in low privileged environments. And where SQL is a secure application, if you just install an agent onto that server, SCOM is only going to tell you some very basic high-level objects and some OS-level performance counters. There's not going to be a lot of monitoring when it comes to actual SQL data itself. When you grant the permissions, you have a couple of options. You can manually create the run as accounts, associate these with profiles, and ensure that those accounts are then also created on the SQL server itself. The MP guide has full documentation for this. Now, that particular area, if you are doing that manually, can take a particularly large amount of time, especially if you're talking about multiple SQL servers. It's a multi-step process, and it does require the input of your SQL admins at several stages. Now, Kevin Holman has actually created the SQL Server Run as Addendum Management Pack. It's highly secure. it turns the account that you are using to monitor SQL, or it gains that information from the SID that the health service, i.e. the Microsoft monitoring agent, runs as, and gives that the permissions to the database instance. So it's much more secure, much easier to configure, and it only requires a few clicks, and possibly at one point, if the SCOM admin or the person running the actual process doesn't have permission over SQL itself, all they have to do is get a SQL admin, someone with high enough rights to enter their credentials during the during the task running process, and those permissions are configured automatically. And then once those permissions are added, full SQL monitoring can take place. So monitoring, for example, the log file cannot take place unless the permissions are actually in place. There's also a bunch of other metrics that are SQL specific that the OS cannot provide. And once those permissions are in, it's pretty streamlined after that. Now, you are also able to run tasks from within Squared Up, whether this is to remediate issues or to gain more information. We'll talk about this a little later, but if you're interested in learning more about the way that SCOM has the ability to run tasks on machines, post a question in the chat and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So, the first thing that we're going to look at is the SQL objects, the various properties that apply to the different objects, and then also drilling down through these objects and seeing what data is available. Let me just find my browser here. Okay. So Squared Up in its native form does provide you with a very high-level dashboard pack, which contains not just dashboards that we're looking at here, but also perspectives off of a SQL machine. So this is a very high-level view that contains lots of information with lots of different objects. If we actually drill down to a SQL server specifically, so I'm just using the global search here, we can see straight away that this is a SQL Server 2016 machine. And the reason that we know this is because SCOM has discovered the classes that define the application. So if we actually go to settings here, we can see the Windows Server class and also the group SQL Server 2016 computers. So as I was saying, where SCOM has discovered the various classes for the objects, we can determine from this that it's a SQL Server 2016 machine, which then allows us to display this SQL Server perspective for this object. Now, on this view, we have SQL instance specific information. So we have the metrics related to this particular object. We can see alerts that are specifically scoped to this class of object. And we can also see child objects as well. So in this case, we can see a SQL instance. Drilling into this object, we now have a different view. So we can see it's a SQL instance from those classes, just like before. We can see the databases that are on this class. And then again, we have a more refined view as to what's been collected for this machine. If I just pop onto the monitored entity view here, this is where we start to see those properties. So you can see that we have the classes defined here, and over on the right, the properties are where we actually get some deeper information about SQL. So for example, you can see the edition, you can see the service name. If we scroll down a bit, you can see the SQL service, the account that's being used for the SQL service. And you can even see as much as where the master database location is stored. Coming back to the instance itself, this is all good. We can see what's running on this machine. Perhaps we are a SQL admin and we have a SQL instance that has 20 databases on it. Okay, well, let's actually drill into one of those. So the order proc platform is my database. This is me as an application owner. I own this. I want to understand a bit more. And we actually have database-specific permissions here. Permissions data, performance data here. We can see the file group and the log files. We can see the free space for those databases, and really importantly, we can actually see other databases that are contained on this server. Perhaps, again, you've started off just searching for the database and you found it via the global search. This is the view that you're given. You can not only see the SQL instance, the top-level object, but you can also see the other databases on this server. And if I just jump onto the monitored entity view again here, we can actually see far more properties for this specific object again. Scrolling down a little bit further, we can actually see all of the rules that are enabled for this machine and any monitors as well. I'm just going to jump up to the instance side of things just to give you an idea for the number of rules that are available for these objects. If I just scroll down and keep going, you can see SCOM is capable of collecting a vast amount of data for SQL. Now, not all of this is useful to every SQL admin or every SCOM admin out there. You need to decide what you want to enable and disable within the SCOM console to define what is beneficial monitoring. You can also see the monitors here, so these being the items that actually change the health state of that top level object. Let's just have a quick look at tasks as well. Now, the tasks that come with the SQL management pack are relatively basic. However, things like the global configuration settings, if I just execute this for this particular object, this is just going to give us the global settings for this particular SQL instance. Now, if you've ever had to either remote onto a machine to open up SQL Management Studio, whilst it's highly utilized, this is not always the quickest thing to run. But where we're using the SCOM agent, you don't require IDP. You don't have to fire up the SQL Management Server Studio locally on your machine if that's how you access it. You can run that directly from within Squared Up. Jumping back to the instance again, and just clearing out that task view, we'll drill back into the database, and finally we'll just take a quick look at the log files. Again, there is a log file specific view here, so metrics that are only for this particular type of object, and this is available on all of the objects within that class. So you can very quickly build out views like this just using that drill down functionality, and we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. So, application dashboards, SQL in the context of an application. You can scope the tiles whilst viewing any object using a real-time contextual suggestion. This is incredibly powerful. You don't need to be a SCOM admin to understand the relationships between objects, the targeting of performance rules, the particular objects that you have to select, classes, groups, etc., to be able to view specific information. Using this real-time contextual suggestions, you can build dashboards incredibly fast. You're able to display objects and their properties on a perspective as well. So not just the health state, you can show any of those properties that we saw a moment ago. And you can also show metrics relating to the SQL objects in the application. So again, in relation to that specific database that's a part of the app that you're viewing. And then again, you can run tasks, but in a slightly different way. In particular, the tasks that I'm talking about here are actually read tasks, which allows you to place information, perhaps from either a particular SQL query that you want to run via a SCOM agent task, or if there's a stored procedure that perhaps you run when you know that this application is having an issue, you can actually run that directly on a perspective, and then it refreshes along with all of the other information every 60 seconds. So let's jump into the demo for that. The perspective scoping side of things, let's just have a quick look at the sales application. So we've defined this enterprise application in our environment. We've mapped out the objects. If we just jump into the map view here, we've discovered out the various tiers in this application. So you can see we have web, app, and SQL. We know that it has two particular SQL servers in it, and there's going to be SQL specific information that we want to view. If I click the Add Perspective button here, this is only going to be visible on the Sales App class at this time. Let's just go with SQL 1. You can change that to Enterprise Application. So this view shows on every Enterprise application, and it's tailored to the information, to the objects that are in that Enterprise application. Now, when I go to Status and we go to Icons, this is the contextual suggestions. So this is looking at the object that we're looking at, this sales application, this enterprise application. It's suggesting objects that we may want to see. And in this particular case, we can see straight away the SQL Server 2016 DB and the DB engine. And all I have to do is click it, and we can see the databases. We want to choose the DB engine, we can just select the DB engine. And it's as simple as that. If you wanted to view all of the objects in that component group, you can go to the Sales App map, and you can select SQL, and it shows you all of the objects in that particular component group. So in particular, the instance, the servers, the database, and the actual SQL Server service as well. This is also used in the performance tile. So if I just create a new performance tile here, and we go to line graph, again, it's going to suggest some scope to us. Now, if I click the SQL Server 2016 DB and go to metric, all I have to do is click into this box, and it is giving us all of the database-related metrics that are enabled for this object. And it's as simple as that. You just select it, and you're able to see it. If there's a metric that's not visible in the DB class, it may be in the DB engine. This is due to the targeting that performance counters use in SCOM. So clicking DB engine and going back to the metric, if I just clear out that view, if I click in here, you can see the vast list of metrics that are available. Now, we haven't set any overrides in our environment. These are just the ones that are enabled by default. There are a lot of them, and as I mentioned, you may want to enable or disable them all, or various ones of them, sorry. But it's as easy as that. You don't need to know that class structure in SCOM to be able to create this. I'm just going to remove that view there, and let's have a look at a couple that I've created earlier. So SQL. This view, admittedly very basic, but you can see here that we have the SQL instance health state, and I've also used the sublabel to provide properties for the objects that we're looking at. So we can see the port information and in the authorization mode. Perhaps there's some other information you want to see there. If it's the log file, perhaps you want to see the location of that on disk. You can add the collation, any of those properties that SCOM discovers. Much like here, we're looking at the database health, and we can actually see the updatability. So one's in read-only, one's in read-write, primary, secondary. That information on a dashboard doesn't sound like a lot of useful information, but when it comes to having an outage, and you can see that both of them are in read-only, perhaps that tells you that there is an issue there that you need to look into, and you have that information at a glance. Again, log file free space, we're just looking at the percentage of free space. But this particular view, this is what I meant by running a task for read information. This is actually using one of our data on demand tasks, which we use when we're running VADA discoveries. It's just giving us an output of the information. Now, in particular, you have the ability to create tasks in SCOM to action against certain objects. If you wanted to create a SQL query that provides an output of information that is just textual, that just gives you information that perhaps your admins are already running to find whether or not your application is healthy, you can write that into a task in SCOM and place it on a view like this, and it will run on an interval. Now, taking it a step further, perhaps you don't want to have to edit that query every time they decide to make a change. Why not just create a task that triggers a stored procedure, in which case you create the task once, and then the SQL admins can update that procedure however they wish to, maybe change some of the information that's returned, and then they have control of what they see on their dashboard from the SQL instance itself. It's an incredibly powerful feature that I highly recommend you guys look into. And if we just have a look at the SQL performance view here, again, this is just similar to that dashboard that we looked at before. This is just some high-level SQL performance metrics that are good insight into whether or not your application is healthy. Perhaps you see a drop in active requests. There may be an issue on the inbound, or there's too many active requests. Someone's hammering your application, perhaps in a not particularly nice way. You can see that from this view, and it's all in the context of this application. Okay, so finally, we're just going to look at some useful resources and just very briefly talk about these. There's a database query result monitoring management pack. Not the nicest of names, but you can use a SQL query when it comes to creating monitoring in SCOM. This is a great management pack for ICE-V. Highly recommend you check it out if you want to enhance your SCOM monitoring using stored procedures or SQL queries or anything else to define the health state of an object. Next up, the PowerShell authoring management pack. This is by Squared Up originally that we've passed to our sister company Cookdown. This is incredibly powerful, not just for SQL monitoring, but if you want to use any of your own PowerShell scripts, as complex as you like, to define the health state of your application, to create tasks, to read information to pull back into SCOM or onto a dashboard, PowerShell authoring within the SCOM console is available. It's all in that management pack, and both of these are completely free. And finally, Kevin Holman's SQL Addendum Management Pack. This just assists you in setting up those permissions. It just takes the pain away. I was a SCOM admin in a former life. My days were filled with adding those permissions on the SCOM side, and then waiting for the SQL team to actually issue those permissions on the other side. And it was a complex process. There was a lot of communication to just get the permissions in to just run basic monitoring of SQL. This requires about 3 or 4 clicks, perhaps some permissions if you don't have them over SQL, but it does save a whole bunch of time. I highly recommend you check all 3 of those out. And then finally, resources. So this is our own resources. So we have a fantastic knowledge base. This includes configuration, troubleshooting, perhaps some how-tos, and quite a lot of the articles also contain YouTube links as well. So there's video guides for you as well. We have the YouTube channel containing playlists, so getting started. We have the coffee break series on there, which is just SCOM and the wider Squared Up space. Anything that you want to recommend to us as well, we have a coffee break series, and we're always looking for input from you guys if you have any suggestions as to what you want to see. And finally, we have our Community Answers platform. Over 1,000 subject matter experts across the System Center, Azure, SCOM, anything IT space, all helping each other out on a daily basis to get to resolutions in a fast, efficient way. Okay, let's open the floor to questions and answers now. So we have a couple already. The first one was, is the video going to be on YouTube? Yep, this will be up in the next couple of days. We've got to process it, and then it will be available to you. I'm just going to pop myself on mute whilst I wait for any other questions there. Yep, so final question. Looks as though someone's just asking if we offer a free trial. We do. A trial is for 30 days, contains all of the features that are available in the full product. It's for unlimited users. We don't restrict the number of dashboards you can create, the number of databases you can monitor, the number of perspectives. There's no limitations within that trial, and the full product, we only limit how many users can access. There are different packages depending on the features that you require, but there's lots of potential there. If you want a trial, head over to the website or drop us an email at hello@squaredup.com, and we'll get a trial over to you. Installation takes between 5 and 15 minutes. It can be on a standalone server, on a SCOM management server. The choice is entirely up to you. Another question, how to monitor SQL always-on instances. Great question. So part of that management pack is monitoring always-on availability groups. We've not touched on that today, but essentially once those permissions and everything's configured and the agent is on the machine, those objects will be brought into SCOM. You just then need to build dashboards off of that. So if you wanted to create, say, an overarching view of the availability groups in your environment, or create a perspective on the availability group class that defines, some properties that you want to see, or performance data, you just need to have a look into what's been discovered by the Microsoft SQL management packs. Another question is, can I run a trial on a production environment? You're absolutely welcome to do that, but it is a trial. Ultimately, if that's the only way that you can test out Squared Up, brilliant. We would hope that everyone has a dev test environment to be able to do that. Ultimately, the way that Squared Up is installed is essentially it's a read tool. We don't change anything in SCOM in order to do what we do. We create a single user role in SCOM for our open access feature, but if you want to install that on your production environment and then remove that role afterwards, that's absolutely fine. There are some caveats. If you want to do the enterprise application monitoring side of Squared Up, there's a couple of management packs, but again, you can just remove them when you're done. But that is entirely up to you. If you want to have a sort of deeper conversation about that, feel free to drop us an email and I can provide some information. Another great question there. SCOM monitors and rules can be overridden directly from Squared Up console, or do they need to be done from the SCOM console? So essentially, Squared Up is more of the monitoring workspace. So everything that you'd expect to see in terms of performance, alerting, health states, that's all available to you within Squared Up. Actually, creating overrides is not possible within the Squared Up console, although, let me just show you, if we go to this... Oh, sorry, that's the wrong view. If I go to this particular alert here, and I go to the monitor perspective, you can actually see overrides against objects. You can view them, but you can't create them. So there's nothing else come through. You are welcome to contact us at any time. hello@squaredup.com will come straight through to various members of the team, including myself. I'm the solutions engineer here at Squared Up, so I am a technical resource for you if you have any further questions whatsoever. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed the webinar. Keep an eye out. We will be hosting more on various topics. This is just one of a new series where hopefully we're going to give you guidance on various aspects of monitoring, and more importantly, the dashboarding that you can create from that monitoring using Squared Up. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.